Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle SMB Finance Leadership Forum. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator, which is me. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions during the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we'll address your questions at the end of the session. Without further delay, I'd like to have our speakers introduce themselves. Larry, let's start with you, please.
Thanks, Eric. My name is Larry Mellon. I'm the tax director in the Chief Tax Office at Vertex Inc. I've been at Vertex for almost 18 years and have been in tax compliance for a little over 30. Appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with everyone today.
Great, thank you. Joe, can we continue introductions with you?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Malloy. I'm a managing director with BDO. I reside in Milwaukee, and I lead our indirect tax automation practice. So day in and day out, I'm working with our clients as it relates to their tax processes and things that they're working on in that area. A lot of times that results in an automated solution. That's what I do day in and day out for our clients. Nice to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thanks, Joe. We're excited to have Joe and Larry with us today for a fireside chat called Strategies for Success, Overcoming SMB Indirect Taxation Challenges. Welcome to our panelists, and let's get started. So the first question is, how has the post-pandemic tax landscape evolved and changed for SMBs and medium-sized businesses? What are the latest global business and commerce trends and new legislation affecting tax compliance? Joe, can you kick us off with that question, please?
Yeah, happy to. In terms of global business and commerce trends, what we've seen is really more sales, more retail sales, especially online. And I have some data through the end of Q3 of 2022 that helps demonstrate that. Really what we've seen in terms of all channels for retail sales, we've seen an increase of nearly 8% year over year. E-commerce sales are up about 11% for the same period. And what we're seeing is a lot more dollars that are spent, 20% of all dollars spent on retail purchases are coming from those online orders. So what the impact is from a tax standpoint is more compliance in the area of the e-com channel and the need for that. And as part of that is really from our business at BDO, we're seeing a lot of that activity, not only domestically, but we're seeing a lot of overseas companies that want to enter into the US market and need that sort of tax compliance help. We continue to see the impacts of Wayfair as well. I throw that into the post-pandemic landscape, even though it's been 4 years since that landmark case. What that case has allowed states to do is to pass laws that require remote sellers to collect and pay sales tax when they cross established economic thresholds. And so 45 states, the District of Columbia, and even parts of Alaska, which doesn't have a state level tax, but locals have adopted some Wayfair laws. We've also seen all states that have a general sales tax now also have marketplace facilitator laws. And what that is doing is anyone that's on a marketplace, it shifts the obligation to collect and remit tax from the individual seller to the platform facilitating the sale. So again, we're seeing Wayfair and marketplaces continue to impact the compliance for the SMB market. I think also there's trends that were in place where COVID had really served to accelerate those trends, and we're still seeing a lot of that. Businesses are looking for more cloud-based solutions. There's also an increased Nexus footprint. Now, Nexus being the responsibility to, because you've crossed a certain threshold, you've got a connection to the state, you need to register and be in compliance with that state. So when we talk about an increased Nexus footprint, we're still seeing that after COVID. We've adapted the way we work, but states are reacting, sometimes ruling that out-of-state employees working from home can create the Nexus for a company. So again, it's leading to increased registration activity. a few final thoughts too here. We're seeing more and more people are turning to technology. 60% of businesses in a recent survey say they are using an automated tax solution to manage Wayfair rules. And I think it's a little higher in the SMB market, which is interesting, a little bit lower in the enterprise market. And I'll give you kind of an anecdote just from my own business. It was recently that I just walked into a client's office post-pandemic, post-Wayfair, met with the CFO, and really he's grappling with all these changes and how to handle it. One of the first questions was, hey, do I need to hire a small army of people, Joe, just to get through this? And I think walking through some strategic thinking and just how it really applies to his business, one thing that we came up with was that to focus really on a small part of the tax world in his business. He has a lot of exempt sales, and he also has revenue, an 80-20 rule, that 80% of revenue is coming from 20% of the customer base. So we focused on that. We focused on what can we do to really handle as part of his business, focusing on that revenue base, and for example, getting exemption certificates to manage exposure, trying to bite things off maybe in a manageable chunk to really get into how to manage through all this change and adapt the business. I guess overall, really, it's been a good time for Larry and I to be in the business that we are. I think Larry would agree with that.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to, I want to agree with you with the, the Wayfair coming back from 2018. I do kind of like to move that into COVID just because of the fact that many people didn't have an opportunity and more, I guess, enterprise level to go through significant state audits with a 3 or 4 year plan to go through audits, and still in the SMB space as well. But I think that what's happened with that is that, we've had businesses, especially small businesses, that are adapting to those changes. And the fact that different regulations have come from taxing jurisdictions through COVID. We've seen that there's been a lot of funds that have been available for businesses, and we see there's a lot of businesses that were unable to get those funds. So we see both sides of that. So I think a lot of the tax implications that have happened Wayfair and pre-COVID and now that we're coming out really have some different stuff. And we're really going to talk about a bunch of those in a few more of the questions that we have and kind of dig a little deeper as we move forward.
Great, thank you. So what are some of the typical tax challenges that you're seeing lately in the market? Let's start with Joe and continue with Larry.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I also want to pivot to some of the poll results, but part of our business in serving SMBs, we see a lot of M&A activity, right? There's always a reason when you're buying or selling really to look at tax processes. For example, if you're in the business and you're looking to sell the business, one thing that you look to is your sales and use tax processes, right? Almost every buyer who's coming in is going to review and find ways to identify exposure. That exposure can impact the transaction or the sales price if you're forced to escrow funds and really manage that potential exposure. So the strategy there is really to look at doing a cleanup of that exposure. Look at your processes, look at whether automation makes sense, because it enhances the value if you're in that M&A activity of the sales of that business. Larry, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think just looking at that and talking about, the grasp of Wayfair and the effects that it's had on these SMBs, I think that, just trying to understand these challenges that you have, like what's happening in the market. Are you required to register and file in certain jurisdictions? Where have you missed those? To Joe's point, exposure and risk is like the top two things that a CFO or a business leader is going to be looking at. How can we mitigate those? What areas do we have to look into to make sure that we don't have these exposures? And on top of that, you could be shaking your head saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to look for. How do I determine where these exposures are? So we're going to kind of go through some of that life cycle and talk about discovery, implementation, and kind of go through all those things and come up with reasons and why we think you should go there. But I too, like you, Joe, I do want to comment. So we did put that poll out there, basically asking what were some of the biggest challenges. And it seems, it was 24% of the people said people, 24% processes, and 24% for technology, which is pretty wide that it's not significant, but there's a good amount, really to break that down so evenly is really a good piece, because someone had to pick between one of them. But I think that if all of them are significantly at the same percentage, everybody has the same answer. Like someone who chose people really wanted to pick processes too, or couldn't decide, they had to select one. If I could see a significant change in one, then you'd see that be the issue. So just touching briefly on that, people is important. Do you have the bandwidth and the knowledge to do that? What processes? Understanding that is definitely a big challenge of what's coming down the line. And certainly technology. No one has the bandwidth to hire a person or a team that's going to be doing this manual process and looking at that. So the processes and technology, along with the people to manage and operate that, are definitely some of the biggest challenges. And we're going to talk about those throughout the rest of the
Yeah,
session.
I really like that response
Yeah.
too, Larry, because people aren't thinking solely in terms of technology when you
Yeah.
think about automation.
Yep.
And we're going to talk through this, right? What it means to have a seat at the table for the tax function.
Right.
You in indirect tax, one of the things I love about indirect tax is you have such a great opportunity to work across the entire business. And that's that process standpoint, right? It's not solely a tax process, but it really tax rolls in so many different areas across your business. And that's why I really like
Right.
that answer. It's not focused solely on technology. I guess the data piece is a little bit lower. And I think, maybe as we go through and talk today too, we'll have some, thoughts for people to sort of evaluate on that.
Yeah. And it's getting your seat at the table. And we're going to
Right.
go into that too. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Good.
The next question, let me display the slide here. So the question is, what does the tax lifecycle look like for SMBs from discovery through implementation? Larry, can we oh no, we should
Sure.
start with Joe on this one.
Nah, throw it to Larry. I think Larry's going to talk through this.
Sorry, Larry, let's begin with you, please.
You can throw it to me. I'm just going to throw it over to Larry.
There you go. So we talk often about, the whole solution, of what you have to go through. And this just kind of is a nice bullet point with these 6 things that are things that you could consider as you're going through this life cycle. And we're certainly going to drop more detail after the slide. But nexus determination. Now, we talked about Wayfair and how its differences in taxation on where services or products are being shipped or performed. So the nexus determination, of course, refers back to nexus when you had a physical brick and mortar and taxation determination. So you have to first look at that. What is the taxability evaluation, right? Evaluate. Do you know if the products or services that you are providing are taxable? And a lot of people look at it and say, no, I'm done. They're not taxable, right? But you still have all of these other requirements to go to. Even if you're generating a sale, you still have things that have to be still evaluated to make that decision and reporting. Exposure, right? We want to look at that and say, okay, what have I looked at? What is the exposure? What have I missed, right? And we're going to talk about that, about determining that exposure. Mitigation and disclosure. How do we stop it, correct it, and how and who and when do we disclose that? We can chat about that as well. And then a sales tax system, right? So this could be a sales tax system. This could be a use tax system. This could be any type of thing on how do you get it? What's the best for you? How to implement it? How does it work best for you? And then, of course, rolling into your sales and use tax compliance to make sure that you have everything right with the taxing jurisdictions to reduce exposure and risk.
Yeah, and this is a linear slide, right? But
yeah,
a lot of this happens, in conjunction with each other, right? If clients come to me and say we need to talk about automation, well, we've got to kind of back up and understand what their nexus footprint looks like, for example, and have they crossed some of those thresholds we talked about? Because before we automate, we're going to have to get into compliance or concurrently get into compliance, right? We can go through an automation project and talk about those things, but we want to make sure before we automate, we kind of flip the switch to start collecting tax, that we're in line with the strategy around nexus and also taxability evaluation, right? We
Right.
understand what the risk is and that exposure, and we've quantified that. That helps to drive all the configuration and the setup of the tax system. That's the automation part. So it's a linear slide, but there's a lot of interplay that goes on there. There's a lot of overlap that happens.
Right. So I think just, not specifically on this slide, but as we certainly talk about these discoveries and, you're looking at from anything as far as, I'm now selling products and services in a certain area, you're going through discovery where you're kind of looking at this and determining what is the tax that I have to pay on this? Is there tax on here? What's my audit exposure? Each of the steps as you decide that you're selling something, right? Where are you going to go with that? We often talk about, your tax department potentially is a 1-2 person operation, right? It may be minimal depending what you have. And that could be because you do not have a lot of compliance. But as you go through some of this exposure evaluation and you see what's out there, you may be increasing where you're required to register, collect, remit taxation. But again, as we talked about, every time I talk about this whole part about this journey from discovery to implementation, it's key, and Joe will agree with me that it's getting a seat at that table. As much as often as some of the, especially the finance leaders, work on something, we often know the tax hears about this at the end, and we talk about how there's nothing that happens in a business that tax should not be involved in, right? You're buying capital projects, you're anything you're doing with tax, you're purchasing or you're selling stuff, everything has a taxation link to it. So it's really important for, especially in the SMB or the mid-market businesses, to make sure tax really gets a seat at the table to talk about all those levels of complexity.
Yeah, and sometimes that's easier in that market, right? In the SMB, because you've
Yeah,
got a smaller function
right.
and you can integrate better. When we deal with the enterprise solutions, we can have a real difficult time bringing people out of their own little worlds, and get them integrated. But in some cases, that smaller approach, when I think of my ideal clients that I like working with, it's folks that are kind of integrated already in their business, and they're able to sort of break through those silos, or they've already broken through those silos.
Yeah.
The other thing I would mention here too is when we talk about compliance, one of the things we do in automation, right? We're creating the data for that compliance. That compliance also includes audits, right? So when you talk about having a data file for compliance in month end, yes, but you're also creating data files to support the audits as you go through the road.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, like, when you talk about this decision making moving forward with the implementation, we know that it's the finance leaders, tax leaders that are making this. And I would encourage, and Joe and I've lived this in the past, is really to work with those users. The people that are doing the tax, to be honest, know it sometimes better than the decision makers and what they're doing. So leverage them to know what works for them and what they need will help you get a better solution, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let's continue with our next question is, let's discuss tax automation and why is it critical for businesses to look towards automation of manual processes?
Yeah, I think as we talk about that, I want to just a little bit on this polling question first before we actually answer that, right? Our organization is currently focused on implementing new tax automation capabilities. So we're seeing, basically 35% saying neither agree or disagree. So they're at that point don't really know what they're doing or when they're moving on there. 31% say they agree that they are focused. 15%, small amount, strongly agrees that they're going for that. That's what they're saying. So with 35% being the highest number and 31 kind of right below that at 31% saying they agree, lets us know that these businesses are out there looking to try to integrate and get with solutions. So what are some of the critical business, to look at for automating these manual process? Of course, as we said earlier, it's understanding what your business is doing, understanding the taxation of that business, right? And that just seems like a really simple question. Yeah, we're selling this, but you have to certainly look at it when you're making a decision on how you're going to tax a product or service, is understanding, besides just you thinking or you in finance knowing what you're selling, is hearing from sales, hearing from marketing, hearing from legal. How are they gearing or how are they selling that product, right? Because how they market it and sell that may be different than your understanding of what that product actually does when you're making a decision on how to tax it. So when you're discussing the automation, you have to be first understand what is being sold, and then you have to continue into that research to understand what you want to do with that product. So the automation piece comes into play where you have tools that automating to take the information, take the knowledge that you have, and transferring that into some automation to help you make those automated decisions on taxation.
Yeah, and it's really a strategy to tackle making sure your tax is positioned well, right?
Yeah. Yep.
To grow with your business, not just nexus and expansion there, but really where's your business going as it relates to your products or your new technologies?
Yeah.
Understanding what the state and local response has been, right, to all the changes that we've talked about. Sometimes those are developments you can't control, but what you can control is looking at how you plan and respond. So again, the tax function is critical to expand, or complement what Larry just said. Being integrated through that business, understanding where your business is going with new products and technologies, because automation works with all of that detail, with all of those data elements to be able to make the correct tax determination. For example, at the time of invoicing your customer, it needs to know those things. So those strategies around automation, they help to clean up, they help to set the table for what you're doing today. But also, if it's done effectively, we just talked about the struggles around people and processes. If you do it effectively, you're really handling things as you go forward as a business. You're really incorporating the overall business strategy and marrying that together with the tax function. Again, give you another example of a client story here and talking about automation. I was just with a CFO this week, and they have some tax tools that they're not happy with. They also have an ERP implementation. They're going live, they think 8 or 10 months down the road with that ERP. So the ERPs, from our business standpoint, they're a driving force for our clients who want to automate. And I ask, we can work with the ERP team. We can work with our partner. This is where Larry and I are actually partnered together, Vertex and BDO. We can work with our team and make sure we figure out the timeline for the indirect tax within that project. Will that work? And his response was yes, but really, Joe, what I need is a solution today. The tools we have today are not working. So it's almost like he's saying, yeah, we've got the ERP done and we've got to do that today, but I need help today, or we got to do that down the road, but I need help today. And so we're not great with what we're doing from a compliance standpoint today. And we can come in, we're going to work with Vertex, we're going to work together and really focus on those tools that he has today and working to enhance in his current environment, but then also take that work and employ it into his ERP integration and that strategy. So again, it's really having that awareness, that tie into what you need from a tax standpoint today and into the future.
Thank you. So how can the tax department be proactive in the digital transformation process and ultimately benefit? And what are some best practices that they should be doing to prepare?
I can take this first, Joe. I think that preparing is understanding where your business lies. We talked through Wayfair and stuff. Like, are you just doing business in one taxing jurisdiction? Is it just one state? What are your city, local, district? What are requirements of where you're doing business to ensure where your brick and mortar business is actually handling their sales and use transactions accurately? And then kind of as you're being proactive, you're working your way out of your area where you're located. Where are you shipping? Where are you doing different products and services? And determining what the taxation is across there, right? So proactively looking at that stuff, you're going to see those benefits just because you're looking at it and through discovery and through education, determining where you're at. And then you want to be able to build that stuff, have a ERP system working with a tax solution that'll be able to help you deliver accurate taxation for everything you're putting out there, your work through mapping, and through that implementation, you'll be able to put all those rates, rules, everything through the transformation process, be able to put that through and reduce any type of exposures that you may have. So registering where you're at, what's the business doing, what are the rules in that jurisdiction for how you're going to tax and how you're going to report that. A key thing is how's the reporting going to work? Making sure you have accurate reporting that's going out to all those customers, and of course, a lot of that compliance comes back up to audit prep and how you do that stuff. And I think, Joe, you have some comments in that area.
Yeah, I think that's great. I want to focus on compliance and audit prep, but I also want to back it up, because when you
Yep.
talk about automation, and for me, data is often the key, right? We're talking about tax determination. So what happens when you invoice your customers? We've got to get that piece right. And when you think about the data that's key, you're talking about data around your customers, you're talking about data around your jurisdictions, and you're talking about data as it relates to products and services sold. So really understanding that data, how it's handled within your enterprise, within your business, is really the key to tax determination. And again, as I said, it's also a key making sure that you're not only making the determination correct, but then you're creating the necessary data files that assist you with compliance and audit prep. A lot of that is needed as you go through and you're managing your growth and your exposure. This all leads back again to making sure that what we like to say, Larry and I keep referring to it, giving tax that seat at the table throughout your business, because who owns that data? Who owns the customer data? It can be a master data team. It can be your customer billing side of things, right? It all starts maybe when you sign up a customer initially, right? You assign a customer number. You go get some of your customer exemption detail at that point in time. So
Right.
you're working together in your business from a tax standpoint. Automation frees up some of that time. It transitions what your folks are doing to be able to work throughout the business. And again, for me, that's one of the things that I really like about indirect tax. And
Yeah.
as I was in industry, just partnering across the business like that, just aligning really with where you are with your business growth. I think that's key.
Yeah. How about before we go to the next question, let's look at that third polling question. So it talks about what tax challenges are you currently facing? And it's asked everybody, please select all. So this could be, could be many people answering different stuff, but seeing that it came in at 25%, greater audit scrutiny from tax authorities. And just that alone, I think that we're both seeing that where, as we talked about, we're coming through with Wayfair decision making, coming through with COVID. We're seeing that taxing jurisdictions weren't making as much money. They weren't bringing money in. So the revenue, so certainly states, jurisdictions are increasing their audit staff. So they're actually looking at, what are they doing for audits? They want to make money. The states have to survive, jurisdictions have to survive. So they're being more scrutinous of what they're going to look at and determine all those things. And that happens. And that plays a key to having an automated solution with accurate rules, decision making, compliance reporting, just as Joe has said, to kind of mitigate some of that audit stuff, is to have those things in place.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, can you speak to any gotchas if tax isn't involved early on in the process? What are the downstream ripple effects and implications? Larry, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of gotchas that are out there when tax is not in there. The biggest thing, of course, is when you're under audit and taxation. Somebody's coming in the door, you're the person in the tax department, and you have to go up to the chain of command and say, "I need a check for X amount of dollars because we're not taxing it correctly." So you could say the gotchas could be of not having taxation right. That audit exposure is a huge piece of it. Being involved up front. We talk a lot of the information that people are thinking about now is more on just the sales tax side. Am I charging correctly? And I think generally, I always use this analogy that most people know how to tax the products and services that they're offering today because they know what they're selling. It's just understanding if there's new jurisdictions and how the taxation may change. So I think that we really understand that taxation of the product services we sell. I don't think a lot of businesses spend a lot of time looking at the products and services that you purchase. And that's usually the biggest exposure for people at audits, is looking at the information that they buy. We generally know what we're selling, but my analogy is we don't know if toilet paper or landscaping services are taxable at where our location or where we do business, because we don't focus on that a lot. And I think we have to spend some time. Some of those gotchas are predominantly on the purchase side, and people end up writing larger checks under audits through that because they don't have that information. They don't know that information. Exemption certificates. A lot of people, businesses give them out as if they're get out of tax free cards. Here, we'll give it to a company and see if it sticks, and they don't charge us tax. Jurisdictions are certainly going to look at those look at those exemption certificates if there's taxation in their jurisdiction. They're more likely not to look at invoices that went out that had tax on it because they already got their money. They're going to put a deep dive on the exemptions that you've collected to make sure that they're valid and applicable. It's not just whether the certificate looks good, if what it's being used for is valid. And a lot of people just give them out as if they're getting out of tax. And every business decision that's made has a tax implication. If you sit back and talk to every leader, any financial thing that you postpone 5 years, any capital project you buy, every roll of toilet paper and everything you sell, everything in your business has a tax implication. So some of those gotchas is just keeping track of some of those unknowns that are out there, and make sure you look for those as you're going through and determining your automation and determining how you're going to register and comply for your taxing jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think you hit it exactly. One of the things that I see as a big gotcha is those exemption certificates. I mean, look, if you're a seller, right? And we talked about the increased footprint from Nexus, you have to collect and remit the tax. You're the middleman in this transaction, right? You're collecting tax from your customers and you're remitting it. That's your customer's tax liability. So let's get that taxation up front. Let's get it correct from the customer standpoint, because what happens with that customer liability is when an auditor comes in most cases, the auditor has the right to audit either the buyer or the seller. So you've gone now from a middleman to inheriting an exposure. And let's manage that. Let's get that correct. One of the things that I was in industry for a number of years, and I think the CFO got a really good understanding of as far as tax was, why am I paying my customers' tax liabilities? I don't understand that. And so getting that upfront decision-making process right is really managing that liability that exists from both the customer side of it, but also the seller side of it. And it's critical that you do that.
That's a really good point, Joe, because as you're saying, you get under audit or you do internal review, you do a reverse audit, something of yourself, and you discover something. Just to your point, are you willing to go back to that customer and say, I forgot or didn't put accurate tax, now I want it?
Yeah.
How's that relationship with you selling to that customer now if you're doing that? Where the back end, just like you're saying, okay, well, we didn't do this right. Now we have to pay the taxing jurisdiction out of our pocket, which would have been a flow through just from the customer when they bought it. And now you're out that liability because you didn't have that.
Yeah, and think about it from us strategically. What does that discussion look like internally? Because you've got customers that are really everything to your business, right? So you have to weigh the impact on the customer along with that exposure and get the right discussion going, because I think, again, that liability exists. If you can win with that discussion, it's really letting your customers know that the liability is there and we're working together to manage that. I think, that's an important concept to build that within the overall business strategy as well.
Right.
Great, thank you. So have you seen any common challenges around implementation? And what, if anything, can tax teams do to support smooth implementation?
I don't know if this is you or me, Larry. Would you like to take this first, or you
Sure,
want me?
yeah. No, I'll try it. So, common challenge, I think that they're just, again, it's the seat at the table. You're putting this implementation together. What are all the steps? Now, we know that most times when we're leading through this implementation, it's a finance-led operation. It's usually around the ERP. And then, of course, you have everything from AR attached to it, everything from AP and tax are kind of these areas that grow off of that. So I think some of the challenges you have is getting a seat at the table, looking at what the risks are for tax to make sure tax is at the table. So many times we've heard of people who come back and say, well, they came to us after this and it doesn't work with this solution, or we're unprepared or not trained to work with this new process. So I would say the common challenges, what can you do for your teams is make sure you have a seat at the table. Make sure that leaders understand how tax is affecting it. IT purchase. There's not a single purchase that IT is going to make. They're not going to put a single quote, not a single contract that tax should not be discussed or negotiated before anything is signed.
Yeah, and I would just amplify on that a little bit too. As part of your getting that seat at the table, take a look at really what your cost benefit looks like, what your ROI can be from doing this type of a project. Cost might be really right in front of you, right? You understand that you're going to license a software. You understand that maybe you're going to go and get some outside help. So those costs are right there. I think it's helpful to think about the benefits. And there's studies, and Larry, I don't know if you guys have done any of this, but I certainly have tried to help my clients. One thing I see is the benefit of automating is that you make better tax decisions. So ultimately, you're driving your error rate down, and that has a direct benefit. And if you're doing better with regard to your error rates, you're giving your people also some more value-added time to do a lot of things that the tax function can do. One of those things historically that they do is they defend audits. Well, if you're getting those tax decisions right, you're maybe looking at your consulting fees around your tax function too, and you're driving savings there. And that can be part of that benefit equation as well. So I always found it helpful and meaningful, and it was really appreciated throughout the business when we could walk in and make our case for automation with that cost benefit and when that payback occurs. I think that helps to drive towards that solution.
Hey, Eric, I think we're kind of getting close on time, and I think it may be better for us to focus on some of the questions that came in versus any additional questions we had. If you're okay, can we pivot that way?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's switch to some of the questions from the audience. So one of the first audience question here is, what recommendations can you make for smaller organizations struggling to overcome tax challenges? Who wants to take a swing at that one?
Well, I think we've talked a lot about this, smaller organizations and the tax challenges. It's really trying to be as proactive as we can. I mean, think about that first whole question, so much around the people in the process, right? And I always think about, when you talk about the tax challenges and especially in automation, there's a scale where the tax department exists, right? One being your most rudimentary tax function to maybe 5 or 10, which is the most optimal tax function you can be. Think about those small steps that you can take, not to go from 1 to 5, right, in a one fell swoop, but really think about what you can do in those interim steps to move your tax function forward. I think, again, it's sort of biting off a little bit a smaller piece of trying to improve, whether it be through, helping your people and transforming them into more proactive tasks, or working through the processes or the data side of it. I think those can all help move your tax function forward.
Larry, what do you think?
I think we need to move on to get through some of these questions.
All right, let's. So the next question is, is there a trend to outsource remediation?
I wouldn't say a trend to outsource. I think that people will look at the dynamic of what they're doing. Joe may a little bit more on this. Joe, let you answer this one since you're dealing more with that outside.
Yeah, I mean, it works both ways. I think some clients that struggle, again, go back to that first answer. 24% of the people, 24% of the people say they struggle with process, right? And you want to have a goal of putting people into more proactive activities. Yeah, look to outsource. Look to, that function, even if it's a solution, it might exist for a couple of years. Well, your data gets cleaned up. You've transformed part of your tax process, and maybe there's a point in time where you can bring it back in-house.
Next question is, are use taxes being enforced more now?
1000%. More taxing jurisdictions are looking at use tax than sales tax. If they're bandwidth and looking at things, they know that you predominantly know how you're going to tax your products. As I said, they're really focusing. You're coming in, they're finding 2 invoices that are wrong on the sales tax, but they're finding 40 vendors that are done wrong on the purchase side. So state taxing jurisdiction auditors are spending far, far more time on use tax enforcement than they are on sales tax these days.
Yeah, they understand their data better too, right? They're being smart
Yep.
about those decisions, and
Yep.
that leads to a lot more looking at, and we're seeing a lot of requests in reaction to that, a lot of requests to how do we automate the use tax process? Again,
Right.
that can be, either a live determination, or we can take some interim steps there too. I think, I think that's key as well.
Thank you. So the next question is, if a company has employees spread all over the US, how do they determine nexus?
Yeah, that's a
Well,
good question too.
the
I mean,
big thing
physical
between
presence.
physical or financial, like, what type of nexus are we talking, determining, like, if you're talking about the taxation, I mean, are you saying employees because you now physically have nexus because you have an employee there? What is that person doing, and what are the regulations for that jurisdiction for having someone? Is that a permanently established employee? So there's a lot of, it's not a quick answer is what I'm trying to say for the time that we have. It's a lot more in depth to determine what the employee's doing there, to determine, and then also determine what type of nexus you're
Yeah.
discussing.
And think of that slide we showed too with
Yeah.
quantification, right? You have nexus. What does it mean? How much exposure do I have?
Yeah.
Think about that step that you can take.
Yeah.
Question is, when taxing the platform, how do they determine the location for taxation?
When taxing the platform,
I don't understand the platform. Like, what are you calling the platform?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, sales tax historically, right, Larry, has been destination.
Yeah,
I think
right.
you're
And
talking
if you
about
could,
where are you shipping the product?
Yep.
If it's SaaS related, right? About half the states
right.
tax software as a service, right? They may
And
look.
if it's a service, is it where the benefits perform, where the benefits receive? So it's a much broader question that we don't have an exact answer to.
Yeah, we'll give you a little bit of a framework of what the questions are and
Yeah.
how to answer those. But I think,
Yeah.
again, evaluate state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction on that.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Let's wrap up with this next question. How do you see tax compliance evolving over the next couple of years?
Oh, I love that question. I do, because I think there's things we haven't talked about it. There's things that's happening. There are things that are happening globally, right? With e-invoicing, and the ability of governments that are dealing with VAT, value-added tax, globally, who are able to, because of the increase in e-invoicing regulations, they're also able to look at compliance in a much quicker format. So it hasn't hit the US yet, but I think we're going to see that as a trend globally and ultimately here in the US.
And I think that we see it evolve. It's going to continue and evolve. We always see things change. I mean, digital services, right? We're seeing things that are digitally done. We lived in such an environment where everything was physical. Now we have things that are digital and the ramifications. We can look back at when we bought software that came on a CD to a tape to electronically to hosted to the cloud, all the different angles of how taxes change. Every time businesses find, and I don't want to say loophole, but find ways around taxation to do something different, it goes for a period of time and then taxing jurists learn from that and determine ways to do taxation based on that. So I think it's going to continue evolving. I think we're going to see things more on cloud across the whole world, and taxation is going to change with that as close as a new technology or new way comes up. As soon as it comes out, tax is going to be right behind it.
And Larry, I've seen you guys talk to it. One of your big strategies as a company, as it relates to indirect tax,
Yeah.
is how to handle that e-invoicing
That's
issue
right.
and what's going on globally. And
Right.
I mean, think about that. If Larry and his company are thinking about it as top of mind, you better believe that that's something that
Yep.
the businesses should be aware of as well.
Right. Because the taxing jurisdictions want their money today, and how do they get it today while you still have to worry about reporting and all that dynamic. So yes, we are working on a lot of that stuff. So okay, great.
Thank you, Larry and Joe, both for such an insightful fireside chat. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thanks very much.